In recent news, we learned about Dr. John MacArthur rebuking Beth Moore for preaching the gospel.
Go home.
But we must keep in mind that John MacArthur believes that God sovereignly and unchangeably decreed for Beth Moore to preach the gospel. This brings us to the question of this video. Why do self-proclaimed Calvinists express disapproval and indignation against that which they believe God has unchangeably brought to pass for His own self-glorification?
God is the one who decrees all things, who purposes all things, and who accomplishes all things that He decrees and purposes. He is simply in charge of absolutely everything. When you believe in the divine sovereignty of God, as Scripture lays it out, you face the problem of how does human will fit into that? If God has ordained everything, if God has pre-written history, if God is in charge of everything, if God purposes and fulfills His purposes, then just exactly how do we fit in?
As one prominent Calvinistic confession says, God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of His own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever come to pass. He has not decreed anything because He foresaw it as future, or as that which would come to pass on such conditions. Now, it certainly seems reasonable for us as non-Calvinists to disapprove of autonomous behavior of errant Christians, false teachers, or pagans who misrepresent Scripture or openly rebel against the will of God. It does not seem reasonable or logically consistent, however, for a Calvinist to express disapproval and disgust for that which he believes was, quote, planned and brought about by God for His own self-glorification, end quote. When I express my disapproval of a brother or sister with whom I disagree, or worse, some evil atrocity such as abortion, rape, murder, or torture, I am expressing disapproval of what I believe is mankind's autonomously bad choices, which stand diametrically opposed to our holy God and His perfect will. When my Calvinistic friends, however, express similar disapproval, they are projecting indignation for that which they believe God has unchangeably planned, controlled, and brought about for His own self-glorification. In short, Calvinists are expressing indignation against God and His self-glorifying plans. So, John MacArthur's doctrine teaches that Beth Moore was sovereignly and unchangeably decreed or determined by God to be a preacher of the gospel, and by many standards a pretty good one at that. And certainly Dr. MacArthur would concede that at least some of the elect of God under the Calvinistic worldview were brought to faith through Beth Moore's ministry, wouldn't he? And according to the actual claims of Calvinistic doctrine, quote, God ordains the ends, which would be the salvation of His elect, as well as the means, which would include the evangelism efforts of people like Beth Moore. So why would MacArthur celebrate the specific ends brought about by God and not the specific means if they too were also determined by God? How can a Calvinist bring rebuke with any level of rationality or consistency? I recently pressed a Calvinistic friend on this question, and he repeatedly appealed to the crucifixion, arguing in part, wouldn't you have been horrified and disappointed by the crucifixion of Jesus, yet wasn't that brought about by the determination of God? I replied by saying I would have expressed indignation until the point I realized it was God's plan, and then I would stop bemoaning it and start telling everyone about it, just like the apostles did. Then I simply pointed to the cross hanging around His neck and asked, if you are still horrified and disappointed by the crucifixion, why are you wearing that cross? My Calvinistic friend and I are not disappointed by what God did to redeem the world from sin through Calvary. We both want that event to be known by everyone. Why? Because we now know it was God's fulfillment of His redemptive promise. The story of the cross stands out as a unique part of God's good plan to redeem all sin, not as the proof of God being the cause of all sin. A Calvinist would never wear a symbol of heresy, abortion, child rape, the Holocaust, or other such evil events around his neck. Yet by his own logic, these errors in doctrine and horrible atrocities were sovereignly, quote, brought about by God for his own self-exaltation, end quote. Proof that God worked in some way to bring about the redemption of man's sinful actions on Calvary certainly does not prove that God works to bring about the very sin that his Son died to redeem. Scriptures reveal that God temporarily blinded the rebellious Israelites, or, as Scripture says, sent them a spirit of stupor, eyes so that they could not see, so that they would not recognize their own Messiah. This was to ensure the crucifixion would take place. And who are we to question God's sinless means in doing so? This is exactly what Paul discusses in Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, and again in the controversial chapters of 9 through 11. But proof that God worked to bring about the redemption of man's sinful actions on Calvary certainly does not prove that God brought about the very sins that his Son died to redeem. This is a common error of Calvinists. They take unique examples of God working to bring about a good purpose through the already evil intentions of mankind as proof that God, 1, sovereignly brought about the very evil intentions themselves, and 2, that he sovereignly works in the same way at all times throughout all of history. In other words, if Calvinism is true, then God worked to sovereignly bring about the preaching ministry of Beth Moore in virtually the same way that he worked to sovereignly bring about the salvation of the elect through her preaching. But the implication is far worse, because if Calvinism is true, then God worked to sovereignly bring about the redemption of a child abuser in virtually the same way that he worked to sovereignly bring about the abuse of that child. This flies in the face of so much of what we read in Scripture about the character and holiness of our God. According to Calvinists, God seems to be sovereignly working so as to redeem his own sovereign workings, i.e., God is sovereignly working to bring about redemption so as to redeem the sins that he sovereignly worked to bring about. Is God merely determining to redeem his own determinations? Of course not. Appealing to God's sovereign work to ensure the redemption of sin so as to prove that God sovereignly works to bring about all the sin that was redeemed is an absurd, self-defeating argument. It would be tantamount to arguing that because the police department set up a sting operation to catch a notorious drug dealer, that the police department is responsible for every single intention and action of that drug dealer at all times. But proof that the police department worked in secretive ways to hide their identities, use evil intentions, and work out circumstances in such a way that the drug dealer would do what they wanted him to do, i.e., sell drugs, at that particular moment in time does not suggest that the police are in any way responsible for all that drug dealer has done or ever will do. We celebrate and reward the actions of this police department because they are working to stop the drug activity, not because they are secretly causing all of it so as to stop some of it. And teaching that God brings about all sin based on how he brought about Calvary is like teaching that the police officer brings about every drug deal based on how he brought about one sting operation. Yes, at times the Scriptures do speak of God hardening men's hearts, blinding them with a spirit of stupor, and delaying their healing by use of parabolic language. And he always does so for a redemptive good. But the reason such passages stand out so distinctively from the rest of Scripture is because of their uniqueness. If God worked in this way in every instance, these texts would make no sense. After all, what is there for God to harden, provoke, or restrain if not the autonomous will of creatures? If everything is under the meticulous control of God's sovereign decree, what is left to permit and or restrain except that which he has already decreed? Is God merely restraining something that he previously determined? For instance, why blind eyes from seeing something they were naturally predetermined not to see? Why put a parabolic blindfold on a corpse-like dead sinner, incapable of seeing spiritual truth? And why would Jesus instruct us to pray for God's will to be done here on earth as it is in heaven, if indeed his will is always done exactly as he decreed in eternity past? We must understand that God, like the police department in the analogy, may be hiding his identity at times and working to use the evil intentions of bad men for a greater good, but that in no way impugns his character by suggesting that he is, quote, the cause of all things that are, end quote. and it certainly does not suggest that every evil desire and intention is brought about to glorify God as explicitly taught by Calvinism's actual claims. Typically at this point in the discussion, there are two common objections raised by my Calvinistic friends. The first one is the you-too fallacy. This is when one avoids engaging with criticism by turning on the accuser and answering a criticism with another criticism. For instance, a Calvinist may say, "You too have the same problem because you affirm omniscience, and if God knows something is going to happen and does not prevent it, that proves that He brought it about for His own self-glorification." But be aware, I am opposing an actual claim of Calvinism, and Calvinists are attempting to argue that we have the same problem based not on our actual claims, but based on their own philosophical speculation about the infinite nature of divine omniscience. Notice that none of our scholars actually make the claim that omniscience equals foreordination. Therefore, the Calvinistic argument is fallacious because it assumes true the very position we oppose. As explained in more detail in an earlier broadcast, we do not commit the modal fallacy by equating certainty with necessity. God can certainly know the future free choices of creatures without being the one who determines those choices. For instance, we would see a stark contrast between knowing your child is facing a bully and permitting him to go to school anyway, versus the idea of hiring the bully ourselves while pretending we're upset about it when we send our child off to school. If Calvinists are going to oppose our position, they have to deal with the actual claims of our scholars, not their own philosophical conclusions about our beliefs, while avoiding the huge issue their own system creates. The second fallacy that Calvinists often will appeal to is a false dilemma. This is when a Calvinist presents two options when actually more options are available. For example, a Calvinist may suggest, 1, either God purposes or determines/decrees everything, or the only other option is things happen without any purpose and God is just left unaware, wringing His hands like a passive observer. Are these really the only two options? No, of course not. Better options are available for those willing to entertain the idea that God may have a purpose in creating libertarianly free creatures. In his classic book titled Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis presents a much better option.
Christians then believe that an evil power has made himself for the present the prince of this world. And of course that raises problems. Is this state of affairs in accordance with God's will or not? If it is, He is a strange God, you will say. And if it is not, how can anything happen contrary to the will of a being with absolute power? But anyone who has been in authority knows how a thing can be in accordance with your will in one way and not in another. It may be quite sensible for a mother to say to the children, "I'm not going to go and make you tidy the schoolroom every night. You've got to learn to keep it tidy on your own." Then she goes up one night and finds the teddy bear and the ink and the French grammar all lying in the grate. That is against her will. She would prefer the children to be tidy. But, on the other hand, it is her will which has left the children free to be untidy. The same thing arises in any regiment or trade union or school. You make a thing voluntary and then half the people do not do it. That is not what you willed, but your will has made it possible. It is probably the same in the universe. God created things which had free will. That means creatures which can go either wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which was free but had no possibility of going wrong. I cannot. If a thing is free to be good, it is also free to be bad. And free will is what has made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. A world of automata, of creatures that worked like machines, would hardly be worth creating. The happiness which God designs for His higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to Him and to each other, in an ecstasy of love and delight compared with which the most rapturous love between a man and a woman on this earth is mere milk and water. And for that, they must be free. Of course, God knew what would happen if they used their freedom the wrong way. Apparently, He thought it worth the risk. Perhaps we feel inclined to disagree with Him. But there is a difficulty about disagreeing with God. He is the source from which all your reasoning power comes. You could not be right and he wrong any more than a stream can rise higher than its own source. When you are arguing against him, you are arguing against the very power that makes you able to argue at all. It is like cutting off the branch you are sitting on. If God thinks this state of war in the universe a price worth paying for free will, that is, for making a live world in which creatures can do real good or harm and something of real importance can happen, instead of a toy world which only moves when he pulls the strings, then we may take it is worth paying.
A special thanks to C.S. Lewis Doodle on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel to watch more. Remember to like and share this video on social media. And remember, you can subscribe by pressing the icon in the bottom right corner. Please visit us at soteriology101.com. If you can help us to spread the news of God's love and provision for all people, click on the support link in the top right corner. To learn how to get a higher education, click on the Classroom link and learn more about Trinity Seminary.